Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in Aachen, Germany, is the thinker most people associate with nihilism. But here's the twist. He didn't promote it. He diagnosed it as the cultural disease of the West. He saw Europe entering a crisis. Belief in God, morality, and absolute truth was collapsing under science, modernity, and skepticism. As Nietzsche put it in 1882, God is dead. Not a celebration, but a warning. If the old foundations are gone, what's left? Nietzsche described nihilism as the terrifying moment when all values lose power. He believed this vacuum could lead to despair, weakness, and what he called the last man, comfortable, shallow, avoiding all risk. But he also saw possibility. Humanity could confront the void and create new values. That's where the idea of the Übermensch, the Overman, comes in, a figure strong enough to affirm life without divine guarantees, to give meaning rather than receive it. Nietzsche's own life mirrored his philosophy. He was a brilliant classics professor by age 24, but chronic illness and isolation forced him into early retirement. Writing in solitude, he produced dense, fiery works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and The Antichrist. In 1889, at just 44, he suffered a mental collapse, never recovering fully, and died in 1900. The long-term impact? Massive. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus, psychoanalysts like Freud, even 20th century artists and political movements. Everybody wrestled with Nietzsche's challenge. He forced modern culture to face this question. Can we live bravely in a world without inherited meaning? And that's why Nietzsche isn't just a philosopher of nihilism. He's the one who showed us both the danger and the opportunity at its heart. Ivan Turgenev, born in 1818 in Russia, wasn't a philosopher by profession. He was a novelist. But he became the man who gave nihilism its name in his 1862 masterpiece, Fathers and Sons. And with just that one word, he ignited one of the most heated cultural debates in 19th century Russia. The term appears through his character Bazarov, a young radical who rejects tradition, religion, and authority, claiming that only science and rational thought should guide life. Turgenev described him bluntly. A nihilist is a man who does not bow down before authority, who does not accept any principle on faith. Russia was in turmoil at the time. Serfdom had just been abolished in 1861, and old hierarchies were cracking. Fathers and sons captured this generational clash. The older aristocrats clinging to tradition versus the new young critics determined to tear everything down. The novel sold over 40,000 copies in its first year, a staggering number for that era, and the word nihilist suddenly entered both political newspapers and everyday speech. What's fascinating is that Turgenev himself wasn't fully on the radical side. He admired their courage, but also feared their destructiveness. By popularizing the term, though, he gave shape and language to the Russian revolutionary wave that would follow. Radical critics embraced nihilism as a badge of honor, while conservatives used it as an insult for those who rejected everything. Long-term, Turgenev's coinage did more than define an era. It helped establish nihilism as a recognizable concept in culture, paving the way for the more extreme Russian figures like Pisarev and Nechayev, and later shaping Dostoevsky's fierce literary responses. So while Turgenev wasn't a nihilist himself, his single novel turned an obscure impulse into a household idea, one that still defines an entire strand of modern thought. Dmitry Pisarev, born in 1840, was called the most radical of the Russian radicals. While Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons introduced the word nihilism, Pisarev gave it its most uncompromising voice. By training, he was a literary critic, but his writing became the manifesto of an entire generation of young Russian students. He argued that society should tear down every inherited value, religion, tradition, morality, even art and beauty, unless they could be proven useful through science and reason. His famous phrase summed it up: "Smash the past, let us build from the debris." To him, demolition was not a problem. It was the necessary stage for progress. Pisarev lived what he preached. He spent years imprisoned for his radical essays, which only made him more influential. Young readers devoured his work, treating him as a prophet who promised liberation from the suffocation of aristocracy, church, and state. Unlike Dostoevsky, who feared nihilism would collapse Russia into chaos, Pisarev embraced its destructive potential as a cleansing fire. His early death at just 27, drowning tragically while swimming, cut short what could have been an even larger movement. But his impact was massive. Revolutionaries like Sergey Nechayev and countless anarchists considered him a moral hero. Even Lenin later admitted that his generation had grown up under Pisarev's spell. The long-term result? Pisarev hardened the image of nihilism as not just an attitude, but a revolutionary weapon. destroy inherited lies, and only then can truth be built. His legacy is the razor edge of Russian nihilism, constructive or catastrophic, depending on where you stood. Sergey Nechayev, born in 1847, embodied the darkest edge of Russian nihilism, political nihilism. Where Pisarev wielded words, Nechayev wielded violence. He believed revolution required absolute, uncompromising destruction, and he lived it with fanatic discipline. At just 22, he co-authored the infamous Catechism of a Revolutionary. Its message was chilling. The true revolutionary has no personal life, no attachments, no morals, only devotion to overthrowing the existing order. He declared that anything, even betrayal and murder, was justified if it advanced the cause. And he practiced what he preached. In 1869, Nechayev's small underground group murdered one of their own members, accusing him of disloyalty. This assassination shocked Russia, proving that nihilist ideas had moved from theory to blood. Dostoevsky based this central character in his novel Demons on Nechayev, a portrait of nihilism descending into terror. Nechayev was eventually arrested, tried, and spent years in solitary confinement. He died in prison in 1882, but not before becoming a folk legend among radical revolutionaries. To some, he was a monster. To others, a model of revolutionary purity even Lenin and later radicals studied. His long-term impact? Nechayev cemented nihilism as more than philosophy. It became synonymous with total destruction of society in service of an abstract ideal. Through him, political violence, terrorism, and nihilism were forever linked, influencing both Russia's road to revolution and the Western fear of radical anarchists. So while Pisarev preached demolition, Nechayev acted it out at any cost. Fyodor Dostoevsky, born in Moscow in 1821, wasn't just one of Russia's greatest novelists. He became nihilism's fiercest literary critic. The Russia he lived in was boiling. Young radicals like Pisarev and Nechayev promised liberation by destroying tradition. Dostoevsky, however, had already seen where that road might lead. Early in his life, he'd been arrested for involvement with a radical intellectual circle. In 1849, he was sentenced to death and stood before a firing squad, only to be pardoned at the last second, his sentence commuted to years in a Siberian prison camp. That brush with death and the suffering that followed shaped his entire outlook. Humans, he believed, cannot survive on negation alone. His novels became psychological laboratories where he tested what happens when people abandon God, morality, and meaning. In Demons, 1872, inspired directly by Nechayev's revolutionary murder, he portrayed young radicals as consumed by emptiness, their desire to topple everything dragging them into violence and madness. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan voices one of the most chilling maxims of nihilism. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. Dostoevsky's gift wasn't abstract philosophy. It was making ideas breathe through characters wrestling with despair, pride, and freedom. He showed that nihilism offers liberation, but also spiritual catastrophe, reducing humans to chaos when nothing higher binds them. The long-term impact is enormous. Dostoevsky influenced existentialists like Sartre and Camus, but also theologians, psychologists, and political thinkers. He demonstrated, in haunting detail, that the death of meaning isn't just theoretical. It devastates lives and societies. So if Pisarev and Nechayev tried to build nihilism, Dostoevsky held up a mirror to expose its abyss. Søren Kierkegaard, born in Copenhagen in 1813, is often called the father of existentialism. His life looked ordinary: wealthy family, theology studies, a broken engagement, but beneath it he wrestled with crushing despair. That tension fueled his philosophy. He believed most people live in inauthenticity, hiding from the truth of existence behind habits, social norms, or shallow beliefs. Kierkegaard argued that despair is the central human condition, the gnawing sense that life is empty when we lack authentic grounding. Unlike later nihilists, he didn't think the answer was tearing everything down. Instead, he saw despair as a pathway, forcing individuals to confront freedom and responsibility. His concept of the leap of faith wasn't mindless belief, but a deeply personal choice to embrace God and live authentically, even in uncertainty. Books like Fear and Trembling, 1843, and The Sickness Unto Death, 1849, dissected this inward struggle. In one, he explored Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, not as blind obedience, but as faith beyond reason. In another, he showed how despair, left unresolved, eats away at the self. For Kierkegaard, meaning doesn't flow from certainty or institutions. It's forged in each person's radical commitment to live truthfully before God. Long-term, his work had impact far beyond Denmark. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus borrowed his focus on despair and freedom, even if they stripped out the Christianity. Modern theologians and psychologists, too, credit him as one of the first to analyze the psychology of meaning. So while later thinkers turned despair into proof of a meaningless world, Kierkegaard saw it as the gateway to authentic faith. His legacy is the insight that we can't escape despair, but we can choose how to face it. Arthur Schopenhauer, born in 1788 in Danzig, Germany, was philosophy's great pessimist. He looked at life and concluded, existence itself is suffering. Beneath everything we do, he argued, lies a blind, irrational force he called the will to live, a relentless drive that pushes humans and animals alike to survive, reproduce, compete, and inevitably suffer. Unlike the rational optimism of earlier thinkers, Schopenhauer insisted human existence is tragic. Desire always leads to frustration, satisfaction never lasts, and death erases it all. We're wired to chase meaning, but the universe gives us none. His magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, 1818, painted reality as driven by this irrational will, with individual lives as fleeting appearances. Yet Schopenhauer wasn't just despair. He offered escape routes: art, music, compassion, and even ascetic self-denial. Great music, he said, uniquely expresses the will itself, letting us glimpse existence without illusion. While marginalized in his lifetime, his influence later exploded. Nietzsche, Wagner, Freud, and even modern existentialists all wrestled with his philosophy. His stark vision of life as endless suffering became a blueprint for later nihilistic moods, preparing the ground for Nietzsche's diagnosis of a world without God and for Cioran's modern aphorisms of despair. Schopenhauer's long impact? He proved that philosophy could unmask life's darkness with brutal honesty, and in doing so, made pessimism an unavoidable part of modern thought. Martin Heidegger, born in 1889 in Germany, was one of the 20th century's most complex philosophers, and one who directly reframed nihilism. Where Nietzsche diagnosed nihilism as the collapse of values, Heidegger went deeper. He said Western philosophy itself had forgotten the most basic question, the meaning of being. In his major work, Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger argued most of us live in distraction, what he called inauthenticity. We avoid confronting death, freedom, and a raw fact of existence. Nihilism, to him, wasn't just a cultural mood. It was the historical oblivion of being, an entire tradition of thought that tried to reduce existence to logic, certainty, or technology. By chasing mastery and control, we lost touch with what it means simply to be. He linked this forgetting to modern crises: technological domination, dehumanization, the rise of totalitarian systems. Later, in essays like The Question Concerning Technology, he warned that treating everything, even humans, as resources was itself a form of nihilism. Heidegger's legacy is enormous. Though stained by his association with the Nazi Party in the 1930s, his philosophy reshaped existentialism, phenomenology, and postmodern thought. Thinkers like Sartre, Derrida, and Foucault all absorbed and reacted to his critique. So while Nietzsche cried, "God is dead," Heidegger asked an even deeper question. Without meaning, without being itself, how has the entire West been walking inside nihilism without even realizing it? His work forces us to see nihilism not just as cultural despair, but as the very blindness at the heart of modern thought. Jean-Paul Sartre, born in Paris in 1905, is the name most people think of when they hear existentialism. With the old religious structures collapsing, he asked, "We're humans in a world without God." His answer? Radical freedom. In his 1943 book, Being and Nothingness, Sartre argued existence comes first. We're born, thrown into the world, and only then do we define ourselves. There's no preset human nature, no divine plan. This absolute freedom sounds liberating, but for Sartre, it's also terrifying. He called it anguish, the crushing awareness that every choice defines us, and there's no authority to hide behind. He rejected excuses like human nature or fate, labeling that bad faith, a refusal to own up to freedom. Instead, Sartre insisted we must create meaning ourselves, no matter how absurd life feels. Sartre wasn't just an academic. He was a public intellectual, playwright, political activist, and even declined the Nobel Prize in 1964. His work influenced generations, from student movements to modern psychology. Long-term, his philosophy crystallized the link between nihilism and freedom. If nothing is given, everything is possible, but only if we take responsibility. So Sartre showed that in the absence of God, we are condemned to be free, and condemned, too, to give life meaning with our own hands. Albert Camus, born in French Algeria in 1913, is often paired with Sartre, though he rejected the existentialist label. Where Sartre focused on freedom, Camus named the condition itself. The absurd, the clash between our search for meaning and a silent, indifferent universe. His philosophy was simple but brutal. The universe does not care. In The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, Camus asked if life is even worth living at all. His answer was defiant. Instead of despair or suicide, we must embrace life passionately, like Sisyphus pushing his rock for eternity, and imagine him happy. Camus rejected both religious illusions and totalitarian ideologies. He believed meaning can't be discovered out there, but we can revolt against the absurd by creating value in how we live. His novels, The Plague, The Stranger, The Rebel, are literary case studies in this philosophy, showing ordinary people facing absurdity and responding with dignity, love, or defiance. Though his friendship with Sartre collapsed over politics, Camus won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957 and remains a rarer kind of thinker, a philosopher who captured despair but offered courage at the same time. So, if nihilism whispers, "Nothing matters," Camus answered, "Yes, nothing matters, and that's exactly why our revolt is worth everything." Emil Cioran, born in 1911 in Romania, is often called philosophy's ultimate pessimist. If Schopenhauer was dark, Cioran went darker. He didn't systematize arguments. He wrote aphorisms, sharp fragments that sting like shards of glass. His verdict on life was blunt. Existence is a mistake. Works like The Trouble with Being Born and A Short History of Decay read like existential lightning bolts, declaring that hope is an illusion, history a cycle of ruin, and life itself a burden. He wrote, "It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late." Yet his despair wasn't cold, it was poetic. Cioran's writing style itself is part of the impact. He could turn futility and emptiness into sentences so elegant they almost seduced you into agreeing with him. He lived modestly in Paris for most of his life, surviving on insomnia, cigarettes, and writing, becoming a literary cult figure admired by artists, poets, and philosophers alike. His long-term influence is subtle but powerful. He represents nihilism not as theory, but as a mood, a voice whispering that meaninglessness pervades every corner of life. If Nietzsche challenged us to overcome nihilism, and Camus urged us to revolt against it, Cioran leaned back and said, perhaps futility itself is the only sincere truth. So in Cioran, we meet nihilism stripped bare, despair delivered as art. Jacques Derrida, born in Algeria in 1930, is the philosopher most associated with deconstruction, a word that terrified some, liberated others, and made him one of the most misunderstood thinkers of the 20th century. Deconstruction wasn't about destroying texts. It was about reading them closely to reveal hidden contradictions. Derrida argued that language never fully pins down meaning. Every word depends on other words, and what we think of as fixed truths are always slipping away. He coined the term difference to describe this endless deferral of meaning. Critics accused Derrida of nihilism. If no text or concept can claim ultimate truth, doesn't that collapse into nothing means anything? Derrida pushed back. He said his project was not to erase meaning, but to make us aware of its instability. By exposing the cracks in grand narratives, law, justice, identity, even philosophy itself, he aimed to open thought, not end it. Still, his impact was seismic. From literature and law to architecture, feminism, and cultural studies, Derrida's lens reshaped how we analyze power and knowledge. In the U.S., deconstruction became synonymous with postmodern suspicion of certainty. Long-term, Derrida sharpened the sense that Western thought had no secure foundations left, an insight many equated with nihilism. Whether you see it as liberation or disintegration, his philosophy leaves us confronting an uncomfortable truth. Meaning is never final, and our search for it is endless. Michel Foucault, born in France in 1926, is one of the most influential and controversial thinkers of the 20th century. His focus wasn't abstract metaphysics, but the systems that shape everyday life, power, knowledge, and truth. Through histories like Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, Foucault showed how institutions, prisons, schools, psychiatry, medicine, don't just regulate us from the outside. They actually produce what counts as truth and even define what it means to be normal. Power, in his view, is everywhere, woven into language, science, and culture, and truth is never neutral. This radical questioning led critics to accuse him of nihilism. If every truth is just a construct of power, does anything stand on solid ground? Foucault didn't see himself that way. He described his work as a history of the present, a way to unmask hidden assumptions and open space for freedom. His impact is massive, from cultural studies to politics. Modern debates on gender, sexuality, surveillance, and institutional control all run through Foucault's lens. Whether liberating or destabilizing, his work contributed to a growing sense that absolute truth had dissolved into shifting cultural forces, one of the hallmarks of cultural nihilism today. Gilles Deleuze, born in Paris in 1925, is one of philosophy's most creative voices, and someone who tried to push past nihilism. Deeply influenced by Nietzsche, Deleuze rejected the idea that life's meaninglessness should trap us in despair. Instead, he turned it into a question of affirmation and creativity. With his collaborator Félix Guattari, Deleuze wrote sprawling works like Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, developing images of thought built on networks, flows, and multiplicities, systems always in motion. Where traditional philosophy sought stable truths, Deleuze embraced movement, difference, and becoming. His reinterpretation of Nietzsche's will to power wasn't about domination, but about creation, an engine of endless possibilities. For Deleuze, nihilism could be overcome by dissolving identities and hierarchies, allowing new forms of life, art, and politics to proliferate. Long-term, his impact stretches far beyond philosophy departments. Artists, activists, and cultural theorists adopted his ideas to rethink power, creativity, and resistance. If nihilism is the collapse of meaning, Deleuze's answer was, don't mourn the ruins. Use them as raw material for new worlds. Jean Baudrillard, born in 1929 in France, became philosophy's sharp social diagnostician of the late 20th century. His central claim was provocative. Modern culture no longer operates on reality, but on signs and simulations. In works like Simulacra and Simulation, 1981, Baudrillard argued that television, advertising, and later the internet created a hyperreality, where images circulate without reference to anything real. Think of celebrity culture, branding, or social media aesthetics. We increasingly consume copies of copies until the boundary between reality and representation collapses. For Baudrillard, this was a cultural form of nihilism. Meaning itself implodes when everything is a simulation. He even claimed that events like the Gulf War did not take place, not denying the violence, but arguing its mediated image overtook the reality. Critics saw him as extreme, but his insights resonate powerfully in today's age of deep fakes, viral memes, and algorithmic feeds. His long-term contribution is showing that nihilism isn't just an idea. It's lived daily in a culture where signs no longer anchor truth, leaving us adrift in an endless play of appearances.